Then let's go ahead. Okay, once again, good morning, everyone. And I hope all of you are keeping safe. We are going through the second wave. Cases are increasing everywhere. Just keep yourself safe and follow the protocol. Okay. I hope none of you have fallen sick. Okay. Chalo, let's go ahead. So, my topic is electrolyte disturbances that we commonly see. How do we diagnose them? What are the clinical features and how do we manage them? Okay. Okay. Just a minute. The people will come. Okay. So I have to keep seeing the screen as well. Okay, fine. Okay. So let's start without wasting much time. So before you know the electrolytes, you also need to know the body fluid compartments. I'm sure all of you have studied this in your physiology classes that around 50 to 60% of our body weight is water. Okay, so if you divide the total body water, that is the TBW, is the total body water, into compartments, you have one third is the extracellular fluid and two-third is the intracellular fluid. So intracellular comprises the maximum percentage, and your extracellular is again interstitial fluid and the plasma. So this is the total body water, which is 50 and yeah, even up to 70% of the lean body weight, and it is much higher in small children and babies. Okay, in male it is more, that is 60%, while in female it is around 50%. This is just an average number. It could be anywhere between 50 to 70, as I just told you. Okay, so to calculate the total body water, why this is important? Because as we read the electrolytes, as we read about the sodium disturbances, we need to know the total body water. Only then we can correct the electrolytes. So this is very essential. So if anybody asks you what is the total body water, it's 60% for a male into the body weight. So 0.6 into body weight. For a female, it is 0.5 into the body weight. Okay. Okay, so as I said, your maximum fluid is in the intracellular compartment, that is the ICF. Then you have rest of it interstitial and a very small compartment in the intravascular, and transcellular is between cell, which is very, very less. However, in cases of inflammation or when there is a infection, then this transcellular component increases. Okay. So as we see a newborn baby or a fetus, the fetus is the percentage of water in the fetus is very, very high, while a baby at birth has 80 to 90% water. And as we grow older, the level of water comes down. For an elderly person, it is as low as 50%. That's the reason probably they have, you see their skin is lax, they have more wrinkles, because the total body water is much, much less. Okay, so that was about the body fluids. Now let's talk about the ions that we are interested in. So when we talk about ions, the major ions, we divide it into cations, the ones with the positive charge, and the anions, ones with the negative charge. So there is a delicate balance between the cations and anions, which is important for maintaining the normal homeostasis. Okay, so the major cations are sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and these are the ones that we because these are the common electrolyte disturbances that you encounter in your clinical practice, be it in the chloride, bicarbonate, protein, and phosphates. Okay, all right. Now, all of you must have come across words like osmolality, tonicity. So, is the concept on osmolarity and osmolality clear? I need some of you to unmute your mic and answer. I need the class to be a little more interactive, because otherwise it will be a very, very boring lecture. So can you hear me? Then please unmute and just tell me, are the concepts of osmolarity and osmolality clear to you?
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right, because I'll be asking questions, okay, at the end of it. So I expect all of you to listen carefully and see the slides properly, okay? So osmolarity is the solute divided by the solute plus solvent, and osmolality is solute divided by only the solvent. So this is very important, okay? There is only a minor difference between osmolarity and osmolality. And there is, if you see the definition wise, there is a slight difference. Okay. Now, one more important thing, the plasma osmolality can be calculated. A lot of times in the ward or be in the ICU, we need to know the osmolality because our treatment depends on the osmolality. So if the lab says that we do not calculate osmolality, you do it on your own. So this is the formula that you need with which you can calculate the plasma osmolality. That is 2 times the sodium plus glucose divided by 18 plus urea divided by 2.8. Please note down this formula because a lot of your entrance questions, your MCQs also, they directly ask you to calculate the plasma osmolality. So for plasma osmolality, this is the formula that you apply because sodium values are readily available, glucose and urea are routinely done tests for a patient. So if you know all these values, you can calculate the plasma osmolality. So you see the plasma osmolality is dependent on the ion, cation. The major contributing factor is your cation, that is sodium, while glucose and urea are other contributing factors. Okay. So this is very important. Remember this plasma osmolality formula. Okay. So we are all aware of things like osmotic pressure, oncotic pressure. You know how the fluids move from a higher osmotic pressure to a lower osmotic pressure. Okay. So hyperosmolar solute, that is high water, high solute, low water. Hypoosmotic is low solute, high water. Okay. So hydrostatic pressure is more here, and the osmotic pressure is on this way. Okay. All right. So what is the major determining factor for the oncotic pressure? That is albumin. So you see patients who are debilitating, very ill, where their albumin level is very low, so they have a very low oncotic pressure. Low oncotic pressure means the fluids in the plasma, they go into the interstitial space because albumin is the main factor which determines the oncotic pressure. Okay, so low albumin level is again a deterrent. It can lead to debilitating illness. Okay. So already we know the cell membranes are highly permeable to water, easily diffuses across to maintain an equilibrium between the extracellular and the intracellular fluid. And tonicity defines the effective osmolality, that is the osmotic force due to the particles which cannot permeate between compartments. So this is important. Tonicity is when the membranes are impermeable and the normal osmotic pressure is driven by highly permeable cell membranes. Okay, so all of you know about the blood-brain barrier. See, not all your solutes, not all your electrolytes or your metabolites can cross the brain because there is something called as a blood-brain barrier, which is highly selective. And the role is, it is protective because if it allows everything from the fluid or plasma to go in the brain, it can be catastrophic because your brain is a closed compartment. There is a skull. There is a limit beyond which the brain cannot swell. So that's the reason you have a very tight blood-brain barrier. Unfortunately, in some conditions like stroke, head injury, a lot of other neurological conditions, there is a breach. Somebody wants to come in? Okay, Inchalim, you're late. All right. Okay, let's go quickly to the osmotically active particles. As I said in the beginning also, the main determining factor is sodium, and we'll be discussing the sodium disturbances in detail. Other important osmotically active particles are glucose, urea, and ethanol, and intracellular fluid, the osmotically active particles are potassium, magnesium, phosphate, and urea and ethanol, because these urea and ethanol can freely move across membranes, so they are there both in the extracellular fluid and intracellular fluid. So what we are more interested today is in sodium and potassium, the disturbances, the various disturbances that happens because of the imbalance in these ions. Okay, so we have a very tightly regulated system which maintains the sodium and water homeostasis. There is a neural signal that is coming from the brain, the pituitary, the hypothalamus. Then you have hormonal mechanisms, you have renal mechanisms, a lot of your hormones, aldosterone, renin, all of these get activated to maintain the normal sodium and water homeostasis. If there is a problem anywhere, whether be it here or here or here, there is a disturbance in sodium and water balance, and which leads to various electrolyte and water disturbances. So this is a very tightly regulated system. We'll discuss this slightly in detail. So this is what I meant, the neural, that is the pituitary, which secretes various hormones like ACTH. ACTH again goes to the periphery, to the renal tissue, then it stimulates the secretion of aldosterone. Now aldosterone is responsible for your sodium retention. Always remember this: when there is a deficiency of aldosterone or whenever there is a cutoff of this signal, there is the sodium level go haywire because this regulation is lost. Okay, then there is another hormone which is secreted by the posterior pituitary. It is called the antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. All of you must have heard about this. So any problem in the secretion or over secretion of ADH can lead to a lot of conditions, including your diabetes insipidus or SIADH, which is syndrome of inappropriate ADH secretion. Okay, so as you see, this is a very tightly regulated system. You have your pituitary, then you have your vasomotor center in the brainstem, the medulla. This stimulates the right atrial volume receptors, which are called as natriuretic receptors. Then there is also signal coming from your sympathetic nervous system, which all of it determines your sodium and potassium homeostasis in the body. So that is why it is very essential to know the signaling pathway where it starts from. It starts from the pituitary, goes to the brainstem, the heart, the kidneys, and the peripheral sympathetic nervous system, which control your blood vessels, the blood flow into the kidneys, and your sodium and potassium balance. Okay. So the sodium concentration is kept constant by finely adjusting the water content of the extracellular fluid through secretions of the antidiuretic hormone, which I've already told you, ADH and vasopressin. And there are 4 independent physiological stimuli which release this antidiuretic hormone into the bloodstream, which is osmotic. As I told you in the beginning, the fine balance between the intracellular and between compartments is the osmotic pressure. Then you have hemodynamic factors like hypotension or hypovolemia, how the body responds to hypotension or hypovolemia. That also determines your balance of this sodium. And of course, if the patient has nausea, emesis, that is a loss of sodium. So what happens when there is a loss of sodium? So all of these determines, including the sugar levels, determine the release of antidiuretic hormone, which ultimately decides whether to conserve the water or whether there should be more diuresis. Okay, so the name of the hormone is antidiuretic hormone, ADH. So main function is to prevent diuresis. That means the main idea of this is to preserve water in the body. So when you preserve more and more water, a time comes, if there is an abnormal release of ADH, there will be a lot of water retention in the body. The kidneys will shut down. There won't be any secretion, urine. So what happens? The body compartment, the fluid in the body increases, leading to dilution of all the electrolytes, including your sodium. Okay. Okay. So disorders of fluid and electrolyte balance. So what are the main conditions that can lead to these? One is hypovolemia. That means a patient who has probably has been dehydrated or is using a lot of diuretics. Because of that, there is a lot of diuresis and hypovolemia. So whenever there is an hypovolemia, all your electrolytes get disturbed. Okay. Then second thing is disorders of sodium metabolism itself. As I said in the beginning itself, the ADH hormone controls the secretion of sodium, retention of water, which ultimately leads to the sodium balance. So if there is a condition called SIADH, which is syndrome of inappropriate antidiuretic hormone, or the CSW is cerebral salt wasting syndrome, this can lead to abnormal sodium levels. Okay, even any kind of stress or trauma plus your hyperosmolar conditions, whether it's diabetes or hyperglycemia itself, can cause a lot of electrolyte and fluid disturbances. Okay, so first is sodium. So as I said at the beginning of the class, this is perhaps one of the most important ion, the cation, which is involved in the metabolism. There are so many pathways, including your cardiac, your neuronal cells, your cardiac cells, and everything, including the water excretion, is dependent on this extracellular cation, that is sodium. And it is the most abundant extracellular cation, and it is the major determinant of the osmolarity. And the normal values, this is very important. All of you, I am sure you already know about it. This is the level that we want. We want the sodium levels in our body between 135 to 145. So if the levels come below 135 or goes above 145, that is when we need to intervene and treat. So hyponatremia. First, let us discuss about the hyponatremia. So hyponatremia, as I said, when the serum sodium concentration is less than 135. So we take this 135 as our number. Okay. So when the patient's sodium level goes below 135, can you identify without doing any lab test? No, you cannot, because the signs and symptoms are not specific. Because patients would have very vague symptoms. Initially, they will have just weakness, they'll be sleepy, and you cannot really identify whether it's because of sodium or something else. So that is when we need to investigate and find out that what could be the cause. So serum sodium concentration going below 135, that is hyponatremia, is one of the most common cause of electrolyte disturbance that we commonly encounter in our clinical patients. Okay, so what happens is, as the sodium levels come down, the symptoms become more and more aggressive and easily identified. So if there is a sodium level coming below 120, which is alarming, it is a medical emergency, it can lead to a many-fold increase in the mortality, because the sodium level, as I said in the beginning, it is important, it is in the homeostasis of your neuronal cells, your cardiac cells, and many other functions in the body. Okay. So what happens? Why there is an hyponatremia? So what happens? There is a shift of water from the cell. Example, hyperglycemia or mannitol. When we give this, so there is a shift of water from the cell, okay, into the interstitial cell. Then there is a shift of sodium into the cell. So what happens? Sodium goes inside the cell. Sodium is an extracellular cation. But what happens is, if there is an abnormality, the sodium itself goes inside the cell. So there is a deficiency outside. And then there is a retention of water. As I told you, that is syndrome of inappropriate ADH secretion, SIADH. SIADH, there is abnormal secretion of this hormone leading to excess retention of water. So when there is an excess retention of water, there is a dilatation. There will be a hemodilation. Hemodilation itself can cause hyponatremia. And of course, if there's a loss of sodium because of through the kidneys or vomiting, GI tract, or excessive sweating, then also there will be hyponatremia. So is this clear? Hyponatremia can happen because of these four things. Most common is if there's a loss of sodium, either through the GI tract or through the skin, excessive sweating, or there's a retention of water because of abnormal secretion of ADH, or there's just a simply shift of the sodium from the extracellular into the intracellular compartment, or there's a shift of water from the cell. That means the extracellular component has become hypovolemic. Okay. So let us see the clinical manifestations. As I said, initially the symptoms are non-specific. They could be lethargic, extreme weakness. The patient can have nausea, vomiting. He'll be irritable. And as the levels become more and more less, there could be headache, muscle weakness, and cramp. So this is very important, muscle cramps. A lot of you who do exercise or who play, sometimes you don't really care about what fluid you're drinking, and you keep playing and you start having cramps. So always rule out your electrolyte disturbance. So it could be usually hyponatremia or hypokalemia also a lot of times. So you need to drink fluids and some ORS. That will easily help the situation. Okay. And as the levels become more and more, become less, so you have severe symptoms which could be as dangerous as seizures, coma, and if it remains undetected, it can even lead to death. Okay, so these are the symptoms, as I said. Of course, there's another thing is a low blood pressure, because sodium is a determinant of your blood pressure. So if the sodium levels fall, there will be a decrease in the blood pressure. Okay, so these are non-specific symptoms, but always remember the severe symptoms which could be dangerous, which is depressed, which are mostly the CNS signs and symptoms, that is depressed reflexes, seizures, coma, and death. Then there would be some ECG changes also. So ECG changes are more specific with potassium, hyperkalemia, but even then, with hyponatremia, especially if the levels go very low, below 120 or below 115 millimole, then you have non-specific ECG changes like QRS becomes wide, ST is elevated, there will be T inversion, but these are not specific, because ST elevation, T inversion, you also get in myocardial infarction. So these are not specific changes, but you always have to rule out electrolyte disturbance, especially hyponatremia. When you find a patient has ECG changes, but there is no history of any cardiac disease, then of course electrolyte disturbances have to be ruled out. Okay, so always remember this 110 is the most crucial value. So a patient with a low sodium level, less than 110, can even have a cardiac arrest. Okay, but it is very important to note here, because there are some patients who have chronic hyponatremia. If it is an acute setting, this is dangerous. But there are patients who have chronic hyponatremia, especially elderly patients, they have been having hyponatremia, their nutrition has been poor, they are neglected at home, so they may have sodium as low as 106, 108 or 104. In my own clinical practice, I have seen patients with a sodium level of 102 or 103, but without much symptoms. So that happens only in chronic hyponatremia when the body starts adapting to the low sodium levels. But if it's an acute setting, always remember levels less than 115 are dangerous, and of course less than 110 can lead to death. Okay, so so let us see this chart. It becomes very clear, so it's easier for all of you also to visualize. So hyponatremia, as I said, is a determinant of the serum osmolality. We said in the beginning of the class that this is the ion which is responsible for maintaining the osmolality. So once we have hyponatremia, let us measure the serum osmolality. As I said, you can get the lab to check it. If the lab is not willing to check it, then you can check it with your sodium levels, your urea levels, and glucose levels. Okay. So if the serum osmolarity is low, that is there is a hypotonic hyponatremia. If the serum osmolarity is normal, that means your sodium levels are normal, sodium levels are showing to be normal, but your osmolarity is normal. So at this juncture, always ruled out pseudo hyponatremia. That is, if the lipid levels are very high, the patients who has hyperlipidemia, where the triglyceride levels are very high, or hyperproteinemia, that's multiple myeloma. When these becomes abnormally high, your serum sodium will show as low. However, the osmolarity remains normal. So in this instance, you do not have to treat the patient. You just have to treat the primary disorder, that is hyperlipidemia or hyperproteinemia. Always remember, that's why serum osmolarity has to be calculated for any patient coming with hyponatremia. And if the serum osmolarity is high, then it could rule out other things like hyperglycemia or mannitol. Mannitol is a hyperosmotic agent. Normally we give mannitol if there's a head injury or any kind of neurological injury, we give mannitol. Mannitol is given basically to cause osmotic diuresis and drain the fluid from the brain so that the brain shrinks, because any condition which rises the intracranial pressure can be catastrophic. So mannitol is given in some such circumstance. But always remember, when you give mannitol, your osmolarity becomes high and you can have hyponatremia. So these are the three things: low osmolarity, normal osmolarity, high osmolarity. Okay. Now, when you have a low hypotonic hyponatremia, just see your extracellular fluid compartments. So if there is a ECFB is low, just check for renal loss of sodium. Ask for a renal excretion of sodium. Okay. So if the urinary excretion of sodium is more than 20, here you can see this. That means the patient must be on some diuretics. He is maybe on drugs like ACEs, AC inhibitors, that is antihypertensive drugs, angiotensin receptor blockers, or he could be having something called as a cerebral salt wasting syndrome that I told you in the beginning. Any kind of neurological injury, stroke, head injury, or a cerebrovascular accident can stimulate the brain, leading to renal loss of sodium excessive, leading to low serum osmolarity and hypotonic hyponatremia. Okay. Then extrarenal loss of sodium, as I said, it could be from the GI tract, nausea, vomiting. Always remember, nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. Just take your proper history. If you feel that the patient is giving history of nausea, vomiting since a long time, always try to rule out hyponatremia. Okay. And other causes like bleeding and burns when there is a loss of sodium from the skin itself. Okay, in burns. All right. Okay. Now, other conditions like you have to rule out hypothyroidism, you have to rule out SIDH, and when the ECV is high, that is cirrhosis and nephrosis have to be ruled out. Okay. So always remember that, as I said, osmolarity is the first thing. When you see a patient of hyponatremia, calculate the osmolarity. If the lab is not doing it, you calculate using your sodium, glucose, and urea. Okay. So I'll be asking this formula at the end of the class. I'm sure all of you know about it. Okay, so how do we treat hyponatremia? Okay, so when, as I said, we go back to the chart and we rule out that the hyponatremia may have been because of salt and water loss. So that is, the patient is having dehydration and hypovolemia. So what we do, we treat the dehydration and hypovolemia. So treat the patient using N, that is normal saline. Okay, normal saline is 0.9% saline that is readily available. So this is the first thing that we give a patient of hyponatremia when we suspect that the hyponatremia was because of dehydration or excessive salt and water loss, because of sweating or GI loss, or maybe because of drugs like diuretics or all your cardiac drugs. Okay, so this is very simple. Just treat him with normal saline. Okay, so if he's in the ward or the ICU, if he's not admitted, he's an OPD patient, then you just ask him to drink water, add some salt. Also, always remember when you add salt, you also need to add some sugar. Okay. All right. However, if you keep treating the patient with sodium only in the normal saline, the patient can develop hypokalemia, that is low potassium level, and it can lead to acid-base disturbance. So we should know when should we stop giving normal saline. Normal saline doesn't mean it's not a tap water that you keep it on and let it go on and on. So when you give normal saline, your duty is to ensure that you keep checking the sodium levels, and once you have an acceptable levels of 135 or more, you can stop this and ask the patient to take oral supplements. Okay. Okay. Now, as I said in the beginning, the severe symptomatic hyponatremia, when the sodium levels become less than 115, that is the borderline, very high, when you already have ECG changes. So here you need urgent correction. Okay. So now, here again, you have to see management dependence on clinical assessment, whether it's low extracellular fluid volume or it's a normal volume or increased. As I said, you need to know this, the extracellular fluid volume. So if it is due to low extracellular fluid volume, you can give hypertonic saline, which is a 3% sodium solution. This is a high concentrated sodium solution. Normal saline is, as I said, only 0.9%, and this is 3 to 4 times more than what we normally give. That is 3%. Okay, so you have to give 3%. This is the condition where we give 3% saline. That is hyponatremia, that is severe hyponatremia. But how fast do we give? What is the target level we want to achieve? We don't want to achieve a target more than 125. Okay, as I said, what you need to achieve is 135, but when you're using hypertonic saline, you correct to a level of up to 125. So these are the numbers that you should remember. So you calculate the sodium deficit. How do you calculate sodium deficit? So you calculate the total body water into, as I said, 125 is the maximum that we want, minus serum sodium. So sodium deficit. So you don't need to know the sodium deficit because you need to correct only the deficit part. So total body weight, as I said in the beginning of class, for a male it is 0.6 into body weight. For a female it is 0.5 into body weight. Into 125 is, as I said, the upper limit of correction minus serum sodium. So if the patient's serum sodium was 110, so this will be 125 minus 110 into the total body water of that person. So whatever you get that value, so that is the value that you have to correct. And always remember, when you do the correction has to be very, very slow. You can correct it with normal saline or you can correct with 3% depending on the requirement. Okay. So normally, I think I've mentioned it here. Yeah, it's important. The rate of correction is here, very important. So this you do it only when there is a symptomatic hyponatremia. You can correct up to 1 to 2 milliequivalent per liter per hour. Okay. So if the patient's sodium level was 110, so every hour you can increase it by 1, that is 110, 111, and so on and so forth. But this should be corrected in less than 48 hours. Okay. Not too early, not within 24 hours. It should be within 48 hours. Okay. And if the patient's hyponatremia was chronic, that is, which has developed over months and not over days, then you have to correct very slowly. So this is 0.0 milliequivalent per liter per hour and not more than 10 to 12 milliequivalent in a day. Always remember. So you should not be jumping and screaming that I'm so happy I've corrected the patient's sodium from 110 to 130 in one day. That is wrong because that can cause more harm than good. So if the patient's sodium was 110, in 24 to 48 hours, you can correct it up to 120 or 125, not far, because the body is used to the low sodium level. Suddenly, if you increase the sodium levels, the brain starts behaving haywire, and it can lead to serious complications, something like an osmotic demyelination syndrome. Okay, so this is very important, the rate of correction. So when it is acute, you can correct up to 1 to 2 milliequivalent per liter per hour, but here again, this entire correction has to be done over 48 hours. And if it is a chronic, then it has to be corrected even slower, 0.5 milliequivalent per liter. Okay, so as I said here, maximum is 8 to 12 milliequivalent per liter per 24 hours. Okay, and the complete correction can be done over the next 2 to 3 days. Okay. All right, so this is very important. This chart is very important, the rate of correction. This is for acute hyponatremia and this is for chronic. Acute means which has developed over hours to days, and chronic is which has developed over days to weeks. Okay, especially in elderly patients, they have chronic hyponatremia. So always correct very, very slowly. Okay. Okay. So again, what we have already discussed, so let's just see the algorithm for quick revision. When the serum sodium is less than 135, first assess the serum osmolality. So for serum osmolality, you need to know the sodium levels, you need to know the glucose levels, and you need to know the urea levels. Okay, I'll show you that formula so that it is, once again, it is reinforced. Okay, so this is the formula that you need to know. Plasma osmolality is 2 times the sodium. So the sodium is 100. So 2 into 100 plus glucose divided by 18. Suppose glucose is 180. So 180 divided by 18 will be 10. Then urea divided by 2.8. So this is the formula. You get the sodium, glucose, and urea, and you calculate the plasma osmolality. Okay. Okay. Okay, so you assess the serum osmolality. If the serum osmolality is low, that means there is a loss of sodium somewhere. So assess the urinary sodium. So if the urinary sodium is more than 20 millimole per liter, then you assess the volume status. You see whether the extra volume, your extracellular fluid volume is contracted. So if it's contracted, that means there is loss of both sodium and water. So it could be because of hypovolemia. It could be because of cerebral salt wasting syndrome, okay, and other conditions like mineralocorticoid deficiency. We did not know about this. You just remember the common causes, that is hypovolemia, cerebral salt wasting syndrome, and there is something called as SIADH, where there is abnormal secretion of the antidiuretic hormones. So what happens is there is increase in the extracellular fluid compartment, leading to hyponatremia. Okay, all right. So if the urine sodium loss is less than 20 millimole, that means the loss is happening from somewhere else, not the urine. Then you have to rule for extrarenal sodium losses, which could be because of burns, from the sweat, from the GI tract. So you need to look at those causes. Okay. And as I said, if the serum osmolality is normal, already discussed pseudo hyponatremia. So pseudo hyponatremia happens when there's an excessive lipid, hypertriglyceridemia, hyperlipidemia, and multiple myeloma. So these are the conditions where you can get hyponatremia, but you'll see your osmolality is normal. So you do not need to correct the sodium levels. So this is why very important. This is a red flag. You need to know that the patient's hyponatremia is not because of hyperlipidemia or multiple myeloma, where there is an increase in the protein compound. Okay, so don't treat this. Again, if the serum osmolality is very high, as I said, it can be because of hyperglycemia, because glucose is an osmotic agent. Then mannitol itself is a high osmotic agent. So this can cause serum high osmolarity. Okay, so you need to know the osmolarity. That's why I keep stressing on this. So already we said, so decision whether immediate treatment is required. You see what is the degree of hyponatremia. So if the sodium levels is less than 125, you start treatment. And you also need to note whether the patient has symptoms. As I said, symptoms are non-specific. Patient can have lethargy, weakness, then it can progress. He can become irritable, restless, and then slowly the CNS symptoms like depressive reflexes, seizures, and ultimately, if not treated, can lead to coma or death. Okay. Then the third point is acute or chronic. As I told you, acute is which is developed immediately because patient may have had severe diarrhea or he has been vomiting, he's not been eating well, not taking water. Then it is an acute case. If it is an acute, you need to treat immediately because you need to replenish the losses, the sodium loss, the fluid loss. But if it is chronic, as it happens in a lot of conditions, including your elderly patients, then you need not hurry. You can treat this slowly over time because if you correct it rapidly, it can lead to a lot of problems, including osmotic demyelination syndrome, okay, in the brainstem. All right. Then you also need to see if the patient has hypertension because, as I said, sodium is required for your cardiac, your blood pressure control. So if the patient has hypertension, then of course it has to be treated. Okay. So again, the same thing which I've already told you, sodium deficit is 0.6 into body weight. This is the total body weight water of a person into desired sodium, which I suppose I keep it at 125 minus the actual sodium. So this is how you calculate the sodium deficit. So whatever the deficit is, always remember if the deficit is 20 or 30, you need not correct the 20 or 30 sodium deficit over 24 hours. You can correct it slowly over next 2 to 3 days. Okay, so this is very important. All right. So as I said, acute treatment that is less than 24 hours, severe, then you need to treat because if you don't treat, there will be brain swelling and that can lead to herniations, coma, and death. Okay, and you can correct with 3% sodium. Okay. Pseudohyponatremia already discussed. So seen in extreme elevation of serum lipids or proteins, which causes an increase in plasma volume. This is seen normally in conditions when there is hyperlipidemia or multiple myeloma. Okay. Yeah, all right. So this is what we have discussed. What is osmotic demyelination? So earlier called as central pontine myelinolysis. This is symmetrical, non-inflammatory demyelination in the pons. So I'll show you the picture. It becomes more Clear? So sometimes it can be in the pons. Pons is in your brainstem, or it can be extrapontine, that is outside the brainstem. Outside the brainstem, it can be the basal ganglia or the thalamus. Okay. So what happens is, what are the symptoms? So you see the patient of hyponatremia, you have corrected, you have given 3% NS, you have given sodium chloride, and suddenly you find that on day 5 or day 6, he's developing difficulty in speaking. That is dysarthria. He's having difficulty in swallowing. That is dysphagia. So this can happen when there is a problem in your brainstem, that is your pons. So always suspect if a patient is developing this, it could be because of osmotic demyelination. All right. So here you see, this is your CT scan of your brain. So here you see this. So this is not a CT, this is an MRI, sorry. So you see this structure here. Okay, so this is hypoattenuation. Normally this should not be black, this should be white like this. So this is your entire brain stem, okay, your pons, midbrain, pons and medulla. So this appears blackish, that is hypoattenuation on T1. This is a T1 weighted sequence of an MRI. So you see this hypoattenuation. So this hypoattenuation is because of pontine demyelination. That means there is a loss of the myelin of the neurons in the pons. This is a devastating complication because it can lead to permanent changes. All right, because we know that the changes in CNS in the brain are always permanent. They leave a sequelae behind. So especially if there's a brainstem involved, it can lead to a permanent disability. Okay, so that's why always remember that when you correct sodium, it has to be done very slowly over 48 to 96 hours and not immediately within 24 hours. Okay. So next we move on to hypernatremia. So we have done this, discussed about hypo. Now let's go what happens when the sodium levels are more than 145 millimole per liter. Normal, as I said, was 135 to 145. So always remember, hypernatremia is always associated with hyperosmolality. That means when the osmolar levels increases, the osmolarity increases, your sodium levels is the first thing that could be the contributing factor which is leading to hyperosmolality. Okay, so when does hyperosmolality happen? It can happen when there is excessive water depletion, excessive administration of sodium salts, or both. It can be because of both. That means the patient is having excessive water depletion or you're giving excessive sodium salt replacement. Okay, so causes of hypernatremia, that is water depletion. If there is a GI loss, there is only loss of water, there is no loss of salt here. If the loss is only water, then what happens is the water is lost, the sodium component in the extracellular fluid is more relative to the water. So that can cause hypernatremia. Or when there is a renal loss of water, which is osmotic diuresis, when you are using urea, mannitol or glycosuria, this selectively causes diuresis. That is urine secretion is more, however, the sodium is not lost. So what happens is your extracellular sodium increases. Okay. Then there is another condition called as diabetes insipidus. Okay. So diabetes insipidus is a central cause. Always remember, it is a neurogenic. There could be two types, central and peripheral. So when it's a neurogenic, it's usually after a trauma to the brain, or it could be a surgery, post-surgery in the brain, and it can be a lot of tumors in the brain, metastatic tumors, craniopharyngioma of the brain, meningitis, all your neuroinfections. So all of these are mostly neurogenic conditions, okay, whether it be neuroinfections, tumors or trauma to the brain. So all of these can stimulate and cause diabetes insipidus, okay. Then the second diabetes insipidus is nephrogenic. We talked about central, this is nephrogenic. So nephrogenic is usually due to some kidney problems, which could be congenital, or it could be because of some chronic renal disease like pyelonephritis, polycystic kidney, post-obstructive uropathy, multiple myeloma, amyloidosis or sarcoidosis. So these are the causes which can cause nephrogenic diabetes insipidus. So diabetes insipidus is nothing but what happens in diabetes insipidus, there is excess urination. Okay, so there is a patient urinates a lot so that the central compartment shrinks and your sodium levels increase because the water is gone. So there's no balance now. So sodium is the predominant cation. So that leads to hypernatremia. Okay, so hypernatremia, what are the signs and symptoms? Again, these are very vague. As you see, altered mental weakness, mental status and weakness, this you had seen in hypernatremia as well. So here too you get the same kind of symptoms. Then there will be neuromuscular irritability. Neuromuscular, there could be a twitch, there could be a clonus, okay, and then finally you will have focal neurological deficit. Focal neurological deficit means patient is not able to move a particular limb, is not able to speak properly, is having difficulty in talking. So all of this can are heralding signs of hyponatremia. Again, these are non-specific because these kind of symptoms can be seen in any kind of neurological injury, including hyponatremia. So always remember, signs and symptoms are not conclusive. That's why you need to know the sodium levels, you need to know the osmolarity, which you need to calculate. Then only you can come to a diagnosis of hyponatremia or hypernatremia. Okay. So serum sodium level more than 155. So first assess the urine osmolarity. If the urine is dilute, that means volume status. Assess the volume status. That means patient is secreting a dilute urine. The electrolytes are not being lost in urine. Only the urine is dilute. So what happens is it could be because you just check the volume status, whether it's hypovolemia or euvolemia. Accordingly, you treat. Okay. So if the urine is concentrated, then you assess the volume status. Again, here too, the same thing. So main thing is you have to see the urine sodium, whether urine is concentrated or diluted. Diluted, you follow this algorithm. If it is concentrated, you follow this algorithm. If there is a hypovolemia, you see if there is an extrarenal water loss. Extrarenal, as I said, from the GI tract, from burns or anywhere else. If there is an extrarenal loss, you have to replenish. Okay, and that is euvolemic, hypervolemic. That means euvolemia to hypervolemia. That is a borderline. That is a your extracellular fluid volume is normal to slightly increase. So that could be because of excessive sodium administration. So excessive sodium administration could be because the patient was taking excessive salt in the diet, or he has been giving some salt supplements, or he is on drugs like sodium bicarbonate. Sodium bicarbonate can also increase the sodium levels. So you need to know this. So volume status is very important. So how do we assess the volume status? I have kept talking about the volume status. How do you know patient is hypovolemic or euvolemic or hypervolemic? Of course, your other parameter helps, including your blood pressures, your fluid status, you see the skin turgor, you see for signs of dehydration. Then you have, of course, objective measures. You can do an ultrasound, you can see the filling of the heart, you can see the inferior vena cava. Of course, at your level, it's not required, but what we do in the ICU is normally to check the volume status, we do an ultrasound, we check the inferior vena cava volume. If the inferior vena cava volume gives us an idea whether the patient is hypovolemic or hypervolemic. Okay, so that's how we do it. It's a little complex for you, so I'm not going into the detail, but you need to know what happens. This algorithm is important because when you actually go into clinical practice, you should be able to assess that the hyponatremia was because of hypovolemia or euvolemia or hypervolemia. And once you know the reason, you treat accordingly. Okay, you do not give the same treatment for all patients. So diabetes insipidus, I told you, decreased secretion or action of arginine vasopressin. So what happened? The 24-hour urine is very, very high. There is more than 50 ml per kg body weight. Normally your urine output is how much per hour? It's hardly 0.5 to 1 ml per kg body weight. So when it is more than 50 ml per kg body weight, your osmolarity decreases to less than 300 milliosmoles. So it could be after a surgery, after a brain surgery, pituitary surgery, one of the most common cause causing diabetes insipidus, or it could be a brain aneurysm surgery, traumatic brain injury, or even in brain death patients when there is no control over the secretion of arginine vasopressin. Okay, so this AVP is nothing else but vasopressin. Okay, all right. We'll just skip this. So what happens is treatment of diabetes insipidus. So first is confirm the diagnosis that it is diabetes insipidus. You look for the factors that could contribute to diabetes insipidus. As I said, any kind of brain surgery, pituitary surgery, or any kind of brain trauma can lead to diabetes insipidus. So first confirm the diagnosis. Then what do? You correct the free water deficit. That is water deficit. Now again, in the previous hyponatremia, we saw the sodium deficit. Now here we calculate the water deficit because there is a loss of water. So how do you calculate this water deficit? So again, here's the same thing, the total body water. The total body water is nothing but your 0.6 into body weight. Now, this is the formula. 1 minus 140 divided by serum sodium concentration. So 140 is the target we want. We want the correction not to be more than 1 up to 140. So this is 140. And if the serum sodium, suppose I say is 160. So it will be 140 divided by 160. And this is outside the bracket 1. So this is the formula that you need to know. If you can remember, well and good. Even if you don't remember, you'll always get it. But this is how you do it. Okay, so whatever the water deficit, suppose you get the water deficit to be 2 liters or 3 liters, so always remember this again has to be corrected over. So first half of it, suppose it is 4 liters, so half of it you correct immediately, rest over the next 24 to 36 hours. Okay, so clear. Suppose the water deficit you get 4 liters, so 2 liter correction you can do it over the next few hours. and rest 2 liters, you correct it over the next 24 to 36 hours. Always remember this correction this is very important because the rate of correction is very important. It's not that you have hyponatremia correct immediately. As I said, what can be the catastrophic complications if you correct immediately? Similarly, with hyponatremia, you correct it slowly over the next 1 or 2 days. Okay. So what are the solution that you use? There is hypernatremia. That means you cannot give sodium solutions. So you have to give solutions which do not have sodium. Understood? So earlier for hyponatremia, we were giving saline and 3%. But for hypernatremia, where the sodium levels are high, and you need to give fluid, always remember, give fluids which do not have sodium. That is 5% dextrose or other fluids which do not have sodium saline concentration. Sometimes we use half NS. Half NS is your 0.45 sodium chloride solution. That is the less than half of your normal solutions. Okay, so these are the fluids that we give for correction of hypernatremia when there is excessive water loss. So you need to correct the fluids. You give this. Also encourage the patient to drink lot of water, because that water that he drinks is without any salt. So that will correct the fluid deficit, and at the same time patient will not get any excessive sodium. Right? And then you give maintenance fluids, closely monitor. Always remember, when you are correcting any electrolytes, you need to monitor the electrolytes and fluid balance every 4 to 6 hourly. So every 6th hourly, or if 6th hourly is not possible, at least 8th hourly, you send for the electrolytes. Okay, you keep sending to the lab so that you know that your rate of correction is not excess. If you cannot send the electrolytes, do an blood gas. Just take an arterial blood sample or a venous blood sample and you get the electrolytes immediately. Okay, so that's how you correct. So even in spite of this, if the patient is still having a lot of excessive urine secretion, you are not able to control it, then you give something called as a aqueous vasopressin. I'm sure all of you must have seen vasopressin. It is normally there in the ward, in the ICU, OTs also. It is a drug which is basically an analog of your normal arginine vasopressin, which is normal hormone, and we give this for severe hypotension. When the patient is having hypotension, we start him on infusion. It is not given as a bolus, it's given as an infusion. But in case of diabetes insipidus, when there is an excessive urine output, that is, urine output is more than 200 to 250 ml per hour, then you can use this vasopressin. We give it subcutaneously. We give a dose of 5 units or 10 units subcutaneously, usually once a day or up to 2 times a day we can give. So always remember, so even after correcting fluid balance, if the patient's sodium is still high, this is the last resort, that is, you can give vasopressin. And this is readily available. Okay, all right. So desmopressin we do not have. This is a synthetic analog again of AVP. It has a longer half-life, but this is usually given, is not readily available, so we do not use it. But of course, for theoretical reasons, you should know that apart from vasopressin, you can also give desmopressin. Okay, this is usually given. They have a nasal spray. It comes or as a subcutaneous preparation. Okay. All right. So we have finished sodium and potassium. Now the next thing is hypokalemia, that is a serum sodium less than serum potassium less than 3.5. So what is the normal potassium levels? Normal potassium level is between 3.5 to 5.4 or 5.5 maximum. That is the normal potassium. So when the potassium level is less than 3.5, we call it as hypokalemia. All right. So what is the most common cause of hypokalemia? Most common cause is intracellular shift or potassium depletion. Intracellular means, as potassium we know is already in intracellular cation, that's why the levels are so less compared to sodium, because sodium is extracellular, levels are high. Potassium being in intracellular, we cannot measure what is inside the cells, we measure only what is the serum concentration. So serum concentration levels are normally 3.5 to 5.5, but if there is an abnormality, there is further shift. Whatever is the extracellular component goes further inside the cell, that is intracellular shift and potassium depletion. So when does this intracellular shift happens? A lot of conditions, including some of the drugs. Most common drug being insulin. A patient who is diabetic who takes insulin, so what happens is, along with the insulin and sugar, there is the potassium also gets inside the cell. So once it is inside the cell, of course, you cannot measure it, so your extracellular volume, extracellular value comes down, and we say this hypokalemia. Okay. So yeah, so transcellular, that is when it goes inside. So what are the drugs? Beta agonists, diuretics, hypothermia, again insulin. As I said, insulin. So insulin, these are the drugs which will drive the potassium inside the cell, or the patient has severe hypothermia with extremely cold. Then also there's a shift of potassium from the extracellular into the intracellular component. Okay. So again, this is a transcellular shift, and when do we have potassium losses? That it can happen because of uses of diuretics or when there is a failure. Okay. Then extrarenal causes like diarrhea, nausea, vomiting, or a patient is on ND tube and there's a continuous drainage, nobody notices it, so there is loss of electrolytes, including potassium. So these are the most common causes of low potassium levels. That is hypokalemia. One is a shift, that means potassium goes inside the cells because of the use of any of these drugs, or hypothermia, or there is potassium loss in the urine or through the GI tract. Okay. So what happens when there is hypokalemia? Again, hypokalemia is characteristic. You will get severe muscle weakness. I am not sure whether I told you about this or not the last class. We had, while we were in the OT, one of our OT assistants suddenly collapsed. He's a healthy young boy, but suddenly he collapsed. So then he was not able to move his limbs. We put him on the bed. We inquired whether he had fever. We ruled out all neurological possible conditions. When I checked his reflexes, all his reflexes, including your knee reflexes, were blunted. It was not there. Then I asked him what happened, and he said the previous day he had gone out to play. He had played a lot of cricket, and he probably did not do enough adequate warm up. He said himself that I did not do warm up. And probably, so then it struck us that it could be electrolyte deficiency. So immediately we did an ABG to find his potassium levels, and his potassium level was I think 1.8 or 1.7, which is very, very low. So that explained the muscle weakness immediately. So we corrected his potassium levels. Over the next 24 hours, he was admitted, and the next day he was discharged. So this is a very common cause, and you will be very happy to diagnose it, and the patient will be thanking you for his life. So he thanked me later and said that I thought I was going to die, but thank you, you saved me. So it was a simple thing. I did not do any magic. It's just checked his potassium levels, and I found that it's very low. That's the reason he was not able to move his legs, muscle weakness, and we corrected. Okay. So always remember, hypokalemia will have muscle weakness, they will have mental status changes and ECG changes. Now, this is very, very important because ECG changes are characteristic of hypokalemia. I think I'm not here. Okay. So there will be prominent U waves, there will be flattening and inversion of the T waves and prolonged QT. So this is very important. U wave. Normally, you do not see a U wave in a normal ECG. This U wave comes after a T wave. Okay. So if you see a prominent U wave will be something like this, like a U. Okay. After the T wave. Normally, this is a T wave and then there will be U wave. So this you see characteristically in hypokalemia, especially when the levels are as low as 2.5 or low. Okay. And you have prolonged QT intervals. So all of these are very dangerous because this can lead to bradycardia and cardiac arrest. Okay. So what do? Treatment, you can correct the underlying acid-base abnormality if there is severe deficiency because of loss. Like for our case, it was loss because of excessive sweating and dehydration. Then you give potassium correction. Always give potassium correction IV if the levels are less than 2.5. So IV potassium KCl ampoule, it comes in a strength of 20 milliequivalent. One ampoule is 20 ml or 10 ml and it comes in a strength of 20 milliequivalent. So that 20 milliequivalent has to be diluted. It has to be given. Always remember, potassium is an irritant. KCl is a hyperosmolar agent. So if you give this potassium correction through a peripheral line, that is a peripheral cannula, the patient will have severe pain and the entire vein will get thrombosed. So do not correct potassium through a peripheral line. Always we have to use a central venous line. I'm sure all of you must have seen a central venous line that is put through the neck veins, either jugular vein, a subclavian, or a femoral vein. So we need to insert this and start the correction. Always remember, when you correct, you should again be very slow. You should not correct more than 40 millimole per liter per hour. Okay. So always do the ECG monitoring. Also check the serum sodium levels because if you correct potassium, sodiums can also decrease. So you have to monitor the sodium levels. Okay. All right. And also other electrolytes like magnesium. So this is very important. So when you're doing correction, when it's severely low, you have to give IV correction. And IV correction is to a central line. If it is moderate, then you can always do oral correction. Mild deficiency, you can just give oral potassium. Spot close syrup comes, so you can give 1 TSF or 2 TSF thrice a day. Okay, not more than thrice a day. Always remember, and this is a bitter solution, so you cannot give it with water. You have to give it with a lime juice or some fruit juice because it is very bitter to taste. All right. So this is for mild deficiency when the serum potassium levels are more than 3, but when there is a severe deficiency less than 2.5, always correct with through an intravenous solution. All right. Now, hyperkalemia, what could be the cause? So we come to hyperkalemia, that is the serum potassium levels more than 5.5. So when the serum potassium is more than 5.5, it's called hyperkalemia. So there are a lot of conditions. You do not know all of these. Always remember, most common causes renal. So a patient who has chronic kidney disease, a patient on dialysis where the normal renal excretion of potassium is hampered, so they will have excess potassium. Okay, so renal impairment causes hyperkalemia. So this is one of the most common cause. And then of course, if the patient is on some potassium containing dietary supplements, potassium is being given IV, so all of these can cause hyperkalemia. But most common cause is renal impairment. So remember, always in a patient of chronic kidney disease, your potassium levels will be higher than normal. So you will also have to have that clinical acumen to see that if the patient has CKD, you need not treat it because the patient is used to a little higher sodium level, potassium level. But of course, if it's more than 6, then the patient has to undergo dialysis. Then other causes are Addison's disease, a lot of these renal causes, renal acidosis, the rhabdomyolysis, tumor lysis. So what happens in rhabdomyolysis or tumor lysis? The cells break down in the body. So when the cells break down, as I said, potassium is inside the cells. This potassium gets released into the extracellular fluid. So when you measure the potassium, potassiums are abnormally high. So that is because the potassium has been lost from the cells because of cell hemolysis or breakage. Okay. So here again, these conditions have to be kept in mind. All right. Then some medicines like AC inhibitors, your spironolactone. Spironolactone is a potassium sparing diuretic. Okay, so it causes diuresis but conserves the potassium. So if you keep it continuously without monitoring potassium levels, it can cause hyperkalemia. And one of these is very common, that is we see is a pseudo hyperkalemia. Suppose it is a new nurse who's taken the blood sample and she did not collect it properly. She had shaken the blood after collecting it, or she had put excessive force on the hand or put a tourniquet and collected the blood. Then there can be hemolysis during venipuncture, that is during collection of blood itself. And when it goes to the lab, so the lab will abnormally give a value of very high potassium, but we'll see the patient is absolutely normal. So then this is when we think about pseudo hyperkalemia. So you recheck, take a fresh sample or take an arterial blood gas sample and check for the potassium level. So this is very common, especially with new sisters or new staff nurse who are joining and would not know how to take a sample. Okay. Then other pseudo hyperkalemia can happen when there is an excessive platelet count, that is thrombocytosis, or polycythemia when there is an excessive RBC count. Okay, so these are the causes, but always remember the important ones: renal impairment, potassium supplements, then rhabdomyolysis, tumor lysis syndrome, and hemolysis during venipuncture. So we have ECG changes happening in hyperkalemia. So you see this. So what happens is, this is your normal P wave, Q wave. This is your P wave, yellow. Then you have your QRS. All of you know about this. And then you have your T wave. Okay. So this is your normal ECG. As I said, in hypokalemia, what happens is after this T wave, you get a sharp wave like this, which is a U wave. Okay. So that U wave was in hypokalemia. But in hyperkalemia, what do you get? You get this characteristically peaked T wave. So you see the T wave is very small compared to the URS. It is less than 1/3 of the QRS. So when you have hyperkalemia, this T wave becomes taller and taller. So it becomes almost equal, or at least more than almost 2/3 of the QRS length. You can see this. So from here, it has increased to this level. So this is typically in hyperkalemia. That is peak T wave, or also we call as tenting of the T wave. It's almost like a 10. It's increasing. Okay. Next, if the hyperkalemia increases further, then what happens is your QRS. This is your QRS interval. So QRS interval keeps increasing. It keeps widening. Your T waves keeps becoming bigger and bigger. And finally, if it left untreated, it can lose to your normal rhythm, and it is just a sine wave pattern. So there will no P wave. It's just a sinusoidal wave pattern, which is dangerous. Patient can die at this moment. So you need to treat when the patient has ECG levels like this, ECG changes. So you should immediately identify, you see the hyperkalemia, always do the ECG and you see for changes. If you have these changes, immediately the patient needs correction for hyperkalemia. So how do you treat hyperkalemia? That we'll discuss. Okay. All right. So hyperkalemia, so where potassium levels are high, so you need to decrease the potassium levels. So what is the simple and most effective way of decreasing the potassium levels? The same drugs that we had given for hypokalemia that had caused the excessive potassium loss. So you use the same drugs. So what do you give? You give insulin, you give dextrose, you give salbutamol nebulization. So all of this, the salbutamol nebulization will drive the potassium inside the cell. Your insulin and dextrose will drive the potassium inside the cell. Okay. And if this does not help, what you can do? the patient can undergo dialysis. So if the potassium levels are persistently high beyond 6 and you're not able to correct with your insulin dextrose solutions or your nebulization, then you can give, the patient can undergo dialysis. Okay. There are also some potassium binders that we say that like K-bind, which removes the excess potassium from the GI tract, but that is usually for low levels of potassium. If the potassium is already very high, then that will not help. So the most important thing is insulin, dextrose, salbutamol nebulization. If this does not help, then hemodialysis. Always remember. Okay, so hemodialysis indication is not only kidney failure, even hyperkalemia is an indication for hemodialysis. Okay, high potassium levels. Then hypocalcemia. So when the plasma total calcium levels is less than 2.2 millimole per liter, so either whole or ionized fraction of calcium is important. So if it's less than 1.15, it can cause severe symptoms. So what are the symptoms? Hypocalcemia, the most common symptom is muscle weakness. Here also you can have tetany, muscle weakness, twitching of the face, and patient can eventually even have seizures. Okay. So what are the common cause of hypocalcemia again? So a lot of things like respiratory alkalosis, when the patient has serious sepsis or infection in the body, then the calcium levels can decrease, or patient has hypomagnesemia. So always remember, when you are checking one electrolyte, always check the other electrolyte. As I said, with potassium also, you have to check the magnesium levels as well. So if the calcium is low, always first rule out hypomagnesemia. Magnesium levels have to be corrected. Then polytrauma, as I said, rhabdomyolysis. We saw when there is a rhabdomyolysis, there is excessive potassium. This can also cause hypocalcemia. And massive transfusion, because massive blood transfusion, what happens? There is EDTA in the blood that we give. EDTA is a calcium chelator. So it chelates the calcium from the body. So it removes the calcium from the body. So there will be hypocalcemia. So always remember, so when you give a patient blood, maybe after the second blood or the third blood, always give calcium supplements to the patient. Otherwise, patient can have hypocalcemia. Okay, so clinical features evident when the ionized calcium is very, very low. There will be hypotension, there will be weakness, tetany, as I said, there will be confusion, seizures. Okay, so this is very important. Again, these are non-specific. We saw that this could be in any electrolyte, but here what is most important is tetany. The tetany, that is hyperreflexia. The reflexes become hyper. So when there is a calcium, low calcium level. So this is very important. Tetany, hyperreflexia. Okay, all right. So treatment is, if the patient is symptomatic, always remember before starting treatment, the magnesium levels have to be corrected. If the hypomagnesemia is there, it has to be excluded. Okay. So what do you do for hypocalcemia? You give calcium chloride, 10% solutions. You have to always remember it has to be given very, very slowly, because if you give very fast, it can cause arrhythmia. So it has to be given slowly over 10 minutes. All right. Okay. So this correction we do only in the ICU setting or probably in the ward, but it's, of course, it has to be monitored, because if you're enthusiastic and you give the calcium immediately, it can cause dangerous arrhythmias. Okay, and you also have to rule out other causes, including vitamin D deficiency, if the hypocalcemia is persistent. The hypomagnesemia, this is the last time, this is really your last slide, when the levels of magnesium is normal level is 1.5 to 2.5. Okay, so when this level is less than 0.7, it is associated with, it is a condition called as hypomagnesemia. Hypomagnesemia, again, it can be because of the use of diuretics, it could be diabetes insipidus, or some of the drugs and infections. So if there is all of these, it needs to be corrected with magnesium supplements. Okay, so clinical features of hypomagnesemia, again, neurology, there can be confusion, irritability, delirium, convulsions, cardiovascular, there can be arrhythmias, and biochemical, there can be associated hypokalemia, hypocalcemia. Okay, so always remember, hypomagnesemia again treatment has to be slow. You give magnesium supplements. Normally, you get 1 gram injections. Okay, in the ward, you probably have seen magnesium ampules, so that is 1 gram. So you calculate the dose. You give a maximum of 50 milligram per kg. So 2 to 3 gram is the maximum that you correct in 1 day. All right, and then you can add magnesium salts to the fluids. Okay, so we have discussed the major disorders, that is hyponatremia, hypokalemia, hyperkalemia. These two are most important, potassium and sodium, and hypocalcium and hypomagnesemia you just need to know. But most important is always remember that disorders of sodium balance are most common. You find in neurological patients or non-neurological patients, in the ward, in the ICU, in all settings, including a patient who's just collapsed. Always remember to rule out the electrolyte imbalance, and then proper history of dehydration, history of excessive sweating or loss. Always remember this is very important. Or if the patient is a chronic kidney disease, patient has on diuretics or some cardiac medication. So all of these can cause electrolyte imbalances. So history is very, very important. Okay. All right. So asymptomatic patients can be managed conservatively under close observation, but you need to check the electrolytes regularly at 6-hourly or 8-hourly intervals and give treatment to those who have severe symptoms. Okay. So it's not only this natremia, but other electrolytes are equally important. So make sure you keep your eyes and ears open and correct all the deficiencies. Okay.